Before being more of an artist and occasionally playing Dr. Robotnik in Sonic the Hedgehog movies, Jim Carrey was making me laugh my balls off in the 90s, and there's a good chance he was doing the same to you if you grew up enjoying movies, comedies specifically, during the 90s. Whether it was the Ace Ventura series, Bumblebee Tuna, Your Balls Are Showing, still gets me every time. The Mask, one of my personal favorites, where he played Stanley Ipkiss and put on a mask that makes him turn into a comic book character of sorts. Or just one of the best movies ever, Dumb and Dumber. Jim Carrey was a master at comedy. But did you know there were many video games based on some of the movies that Jim Carrey starred in? Not all his best works, but games regardless. Of course, nobody wanted to pay for his likeness, so you won't actually see Jim Carrey per se, but here are 7 games that were based off of Jim Carrey movies. You know what else would tickle our funny bone? If you headed on over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames. Yes, that is our main channel where we support independent developers and publishers. It'll also help to keep the lights on over here at I Dream of Retro Games. You'll gain Discord access to an amazing indie gaming community, early ad-free shows, shoutouts at the end of every video we produce, and even free games depending on which tier you select. Your gaming community is waiting for you. Let's begin this list with a little bit of Christmas, what do you say? No, there's not a Dumb and Dumber game starring Lloyd Christmas. Rather, we're talking about The Grinch, which got a few different video games, believe it or not. This is based off of the 2000 movie starring Jim Carrey, though the Grinch character actually goes all the way back to 1957, and fun fact, I've actually had the privilege of visiting the Dr. Seuss Museum. It's a really cool place if you ever get a chance to go. I actually saw the 2000 Grinch movie in theater. I was pretty young back then, but I remember being greatly entertained by it. I was impressed with the visuals, and even watching it today, I still think it's really well made. Now, apparently, Jim Carrey did not have a good time making this movie. He was pretty agitated, I guess is a word for it. Putting on the makeup was apparently a huge pain in the ass. It certainly looks like it, and this wasn't really a fun film for him. The movie was directed by Ron Howard, with a screenplay written by Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman, and I have to say, they did a really good job of recreating the world of Whoville. The characters look like they're out of the book, the houses, everything is really well detailed in this movie. I think it's a fun watch. I know a lot of folks didn't care for it, but me personally, I did greatly enjoy it, and it has some good performances. I actually think Jim Carrey is really quite good in the film, as he usually is, despite the fact that he clearly was annoyed by having to play this character. Wouldn't rank it in his top 5 movies, but it's still a good family Christmas movie to watch. Anyways, as would happen often, there was a tie-in video game, actually a couple, for The Grinch. Also released in 2000, you had a PlayStation Grinch game on November 10th of 2000 here in North America. There was a Dreamcast version just a little bit later, November 22nd, that came out. And then there was a Game Boy Color game, which I'll touch on in a moment, a much different game that also came out in November. So all around the same time, but the Game Boy Color game drastically different. As for PlayStation and Dreamcast, well, I highly recommend, if you do want to check this out, going with the Dreamcast version. Obviously, it's going to run better on Dreamcast. It's a better experience overall. It looks better, it runs better, it plays better, it sounds better, the whole deal. At first, when I started playing the game, I thought it was going to be more like a Spyro-style 3D collectathon, but it doesn't really have the same pacing and action that made that game a lot of fun. No, rather, the Grinch is pretty slow. He has this burp belch attack that he can use at enemies. There's a little bit of stealth involved in the game, but it's a lot about collecting. The jumping doesn't feel all that great. It's just not a good playing game overall. I thought they had a cool opportunity here to make like a Mario 64 style game, again like a Spyro style game, but instead it's just mediocre all around. The Grinch was developed by Artificial Mind and Movement on the PlayStation and Dreamcast, and it was published by Konami, believe it or not. But when you go over to the Game Boy Color version, you get more of an 80s arcade-style game. It actually reminded me a little bit of Pac-Man, where you're navigating the Grinch through mazes and you're trying to avoid being caught. So, you know, as someone who loves arcade-style gameplay, I actually got on with this one. I ended up going through more levels than I was expecting to for this video. It's fairly addicting. There's even different characters that you can play as throughout the adventure, so I actually recommend checking this out. If you can track down a Game Boy Color and a cart, it's probably not too hard to do. then this one does offer up some fun. But as far as the PlayStation and Dreamcast game, I'm gonna have to be a bit of a Grinch and say avoid those, but that's just my opinion. And no, it is not even close to the likeness of Jim Carrey. This looks more like the Grinch that you would find in the book. Next, we're gonna go over to 1995. Not the most liked Batman movie out there, but I was a kid when I saw this. I was like, I think 9 years old when Batman Forever hit. Yes, 1995, baby. It had Tommy Lee Jones, Jim Carrey, Nicole Kidman, Chris O'Donnell, actually a star-studded lineup. And Jim Carrey here was playing the Riddler. You know, on paper, that sounds really great. Jim Carrey is this over-the-top zany character, and it didn't actually work for me on screen as much as I was hoping, and the special effects in this movie are really just kind of a laugh if you go back and watch it today. But I don't know, what can I say about this movie? It's entertaining. I don't think it's a complete dud. A lot of people think it's one of the worst Batman movies of all time. I wouldn't go that far. I think there is some entertainment value and some pretty decent performances here. I actually think that Tommy Lee Jones does a pretty good job as Two-Face in the movie, but overall, it could have been better, and Val Kilmer as Batman, pretty forgettable in my opinion. The movie had a massive budget for the time. I mean, we think $100 million is fairly high for a movie now, and hell, there's video games that cost that too these days, well over that, believe it or not. This was $100 million in 1995, so I was actually shocked when I looked that up. It did make $336 million in the end, so certainly turned a profit, but boy, that was an expensive movie, and I can kind of remember why, because I remember seeing marketing for this movie all over the place. I think at one point even McDonald's had a tie-in. I was just seeing Batman Forever everywhere, though. Naturally, with a movie making $300+ million, you're gonna have video games. And in the case of Batman Forever, it's interesting because there are two different video games, really. There's Batman Forever, the arcade game, and then there's just Batman Forever. What's interesting about Batman Forever, the arcade game, was that this was Acclaim's first foray into the arcade scene. Yes, this game was from Acclaim Entertainment. The game was also built on technology that would go on to be what was used in both the 32X and the Sega Saturn. Now, apparently they also had every intention to get this game on the Atari Jaguar CD, but that didn't end up happening. So ultimately, it ends up coming out in arcades on the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn in 1996. As a huge beat-em-up fan, I actually did get some entertainment value out of playing Batman Forever, the arcade game. It is by no means perfect. It looks kind of blocky. It runs actually really fast, and it can be hard to tell what's going on the screen. There's lots of flashing lights and flickering and all sorts of nonsense, but looking at it as an arcade-style 2D beat-em-up experience, it is entertaining. There's some decent combos here. Don't get me wrong, it's not great, but there is some entertainment value here. I think it's at least worth revisiting at some point. When compared to the other Batman Forever game, it actually feels quite great. So obviously, Mortal Kombat was huge at the time, and this one came from developer Probe Entertainment, and of course, Acclaim Entertainment was the publisher on it. It used motion capture technology, which was very similar to what you saw in the Mortal Kombat series. You know, you had the digitized sprites. It looks pretty silly. It has its charms today, but it was very popular at that time. This version of Batman Forever was released on many platforms, including the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the Game Gear, the Game Boy, the R-Zone, and yes, even PC. The closest thing I can compare Batman Forever to is, think about Mortal Kombat Mythology, Sub-Zero. That game was not great either, but this is even worse than that. That at least had a few things going for it, but Batman Forever kind of tries to do the same thing where it has Mortal Kombat style controls in a 2D side-scroller, and it fails spectacularly. The game is really choppy, it is not fun to play, it doesn't sound good, there's really not many redeeming qualities or reasons to check this one out, except for morbid curiosity if you have to play every Batman game. There are plenty of bad Batman games out there, but this one certainly stacks up there with the best of them. The Game Boy version, the Game Gear, it really doesn't matter. You're getting a bad video game. Alright then, from Batman Forever, we go to one of the more famous Jim Carrey movies. Did you know it had a video game and an animated series? Now, I'm cheating a little bit because This game on PC, Ace Ventura, the CD-ROM game, is actually based on the cartoon that was released around the same time in 1996. It is a point-and-click adventure. It is not specifically based on the movie then. However, really on this list, this is the closest to the likeness of Jim Carrey that you'll get. Do we finally get a good video game though, you ask? No, we don't. We get a really, really bad point-and-click. Actually, it has its charms. You know, you get some of the catchphrases from Ace Ventura that he's famous for in the movies, but it plays really bad. It's extremely choppy, and I got to one point, which you're seeing here, where I just could not get through this frustration. So it is a interesting relic of the past, but it plays bad. It looks alright though, and it does have a little bit of that Ace Ventura sense of humor. So really hard to find. Not going to be an easy game for you to track down necessarily if you want to get a physical copy, and not going to be easy to run either, but it can be done. And hey, if you're a die-hard Jim Carrey fan that has to have everything to do with him, or just an Ace Ventura fan and you have to have everything to do with that series, well then, seek this one out and have a laugh for like 20 minutes, and then you're probably not going to want to play this anymore. Hooray, the part of the list I've been looking forward to. I am a huge fan of the 1994 film The Mask. It is based on a comic. I'm not as familiar with the comic book series, but gosh, I just watched this movie religiously, mainly because I was absolutely infatuated with Cameron Diaz, which, by the way, this is her debut in film. This might surprise you, but the film was directed by a gentleman named Chuck Russell, who actually directed 1987's A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. That was a fun fact to learn. He also did such films as The Blob in 1988, he did Jungly, he did I Am Wrath, Bless the Child, and Witchboard coming up here in 2024. Maybe that came out, I'm not sure, but apparently he's still a working director to this day. Anyways, in The Mask, Jim Carrey plays a banker who's kind of down on his luck, things aren't going his way, but he discovers this mystical mask, puts it on, and it transforms him into a magical character that's not afraid of anything, will go after the things he loves, and is completely over the top, but also gets into a lot of trouble in crazy situations. So I think The Mask holds up really well even today. You know, you would think with old CG quality, the movie wouldn't look good, but the CG used in this movie really is still quite impressive to me. I was really shocked at how good the movie looks. It actually beats a lot of more modern movies that use CG, in my opinion. So The Mask is still well worth your time. It's a great story, good comedy, lots of memorable lines, highly recommended. So when I heard there was a video game on the Super Nintendo, I was like, wait, what? I had totally forgotten about that. So I had to check it out, and it is, not a good game. Developed and published by Black Pearl Software, 1995's The Mask is exclusively on the Super Nintendo, so it didn't go to any other platforms. And I'll say this about The Mask, it at least tries to emulate the look and feel of the movie. The animations in the game are actually very impressive. It does remind you of the character. He even does some of the antics from the movie, like the giant horn scene, for example, which is infamous. Again, it won't look exactly like the movie. They didn't want to pay Jim Carrey or Cameron Diaz or any of them for that matter if they could avoid it, and they damn sure did avoid it. But the real problem with this game is the level design. I just found it to get clunky. I was bumping into a lot of walls. It could be really hard to tell where to go next, and it got frustrating in a hurry. It didn't exactly make me want to continue playing it. A lot of bumping around, bumbling, fumbling, being lost. It's a shame because there are some elements to this game that made me want to explore it further, but I just couldn't get past the very poor level design. A few fun facts about this project though, it actually had started out as more of a beat 'em up, and I'm a little disappointed that that's not the route they went because really, The Mask feels kind of perfect for a beat-em-up environment, and there was also a Sega Genesis version planned, but it ultimately didn't end up coming out. Unfortunately, it just took too long, and the time for the movie's popularity had passed. Our next video game based on a Jim Carrey movie is one that nearly missed this list, and I had almost forgotten entirely, so shout out to X Hardcore Gamer for discovering it. Kick-Ass 2 was a movie that was released in 2013, a superhero film, obviously the follow-up to the original Kick-Ass, which is a really interesting twist on the superhero genre. Really innovative, I thought. It was a fun watch, and I highly recommend it. Perhaps you remember a bit of controversy around the second movie, though, involving Jim Carrey. That's because he actually asked people to not go see this movie. He said he no longer supports it, and he filmed it before the tragic events that occurred at Sandy Hook Elementary School with the shooting. So Jim Carrey just felt like the timing wasn't right, and of course, when you have one of the stars of your movie telling people not to go see the movie, well, that's not necessarily a good look. Kick-Ass 2 was not as successful as the original, though it did actually still seem to turn a little bit of a profit here. It had a budget of $28 million and walked away with $60.8. But obviously, marketing and things like that got more expensive at this point. This is 2013 we're talking about, so it didn't exactly turn a huge profit. Well, Jim Carrey should have also told us not to play Kick-Ass 2 the game, because it is a dreadful beat-em-up that was released on PC, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360, and it is notoriously awful, unstable, a complete juddery mess of a game. In fact, in attempting to capture footage for this game, ex-hardcore gamer's computer crashed, and for some reason it changed all the fonts on his Windows desktop, so I don't know exactly what the hell this product is still doing on Steam at this point, but if you want to experience hell in video game form, well then $9.99 over on Steam will get you Kick-Ass 2. Alright, we began this list with a Christmas movie, and we'll end it with a Christmas movie. I guess Jim Carrey has a thing for Christmas movies, and I have to admit, this is the only film on this list that I have not personally seen. We're talking about A Christmas Carol from 2009. It was directed by Robert Zemeckis, and it is of course based on A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Jim Carrey plays Ebenezer Scrooge himself, and this movie had a massive budget of estimations between $175 and $200 million. It went on to make $325 million, so when you factor the marketing and everything, this film probably cost closer to $400 million when all was said and done, and it didn't really turn a profit. No surprise though, it got a video game on the Nintendo DS, and made by Sumo Digital of all developers. That's not something that I saw coming, but it's basically a point-and-click find-em game with some mini-games as well. A very strange product. You can actually trick Scrooge at times by blowing on the screen or distracting him by clicking on certain objects. It's a very interesting game. It's actually competently made, even though I'm not necessarily into find-em games so much and it's not my genre of choice. It is actually a fairly well-made product. The visuals are fairly nice, the sound design works well, and it puts you in that Christmas spirit, and overall, you know, it's a very simple game, but it's not that bad at all. If you want to get in the mood for Christmas, there's just not a lot of Christmas video games in general, so this one's at least worth checking out. So there you go, folks. This was an interesting list to go for, but those are video games based off of Jim Carrey movies. Let me know in the comments below, did I miss one? It's entirely possible. You just never know in the world of video games. But as always, we hope you enjoyed this list, and we thank you so much. Do be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you want to see more great retro content like this, and consider heading over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames if you'd like to fuel our mission of bringing a voice to the voiceless ones in gaming. I'll talk to you all soon and see you in the next video. I promise we will make them sooner rather than later. I know it's been a little slow over on the channel.